Morning, everybody. Hope you're well. So back to the sutta, back to the mirror of truth. And I was sort of thinking this morning. It's well, what's the difference between the talk today and the talk yesterday? They're very similar, actually, in many ways. And it's a bit like Karunanata and I mean, was sort of heard. I like to think of it like this: kind of heard the Buddha give this discourse to Ananda. The Buddha was old, wasn't he? So it's the Maha-Parinibbhana Sutta, and he's been pottering around with Ananda, and he's on his last tour, and so he must be it must be 80, and Ananda's just asking these questions, isn't he? And so the Buddha gives this discourse, and it's as if I think Karunanata's on one side of the grove or the glade, and I'm on the other. So that Karunanata hears some things which I hear, and then I hear things that he hears and he thinks hears that I think, but there's some differences too. So the trick really is to weave them all together and in a way to get the two understandings to reinforce each other into a sort of a rounded out sense of what the discourse is really about. And I haven't tried really to make the two talks too different. I mean, I did change it after the Karunanata's talk, but I only really changed the order of things. And there are bits, where we've quoted the same stuff, and I've just left it in because actually the repetition is fine. It's not a problem. And in actual fact, I nicked a piece of his talk and put it in mine, because so we'll see that a bit later on. So I'm not trying to be fully different. I think this is the point from him. So let's go back to the sutta anyway. So you remember that the Buddha was receiving requests. He was actually receiving the request from Ananda. To give a sense of the nature of the rebirths of several practitioners that had died recently in the Sangha, and this was becoming troublesome to the Buddha, as he said, because he didn't want every time a practitioner died to have to then tell Ananda what the nature of the rebirth will be. So he decides that he would then set out what was required to become a stream enterer. I'll say a bit more about that later, so that people then can decide for themselves whether somebody would get a favourable rebirth. And you remember that Karunanata mentioned that Vishwapani's commentary on this suggested that the Buddha was being more than a little ironic in giving this reply, in part, I think, because someone who was a stream enterer certainly wouldn't need to know. They wouldn't need to be judging it according to external criteria, but also they'd be unlikely to tell anybody else in any case. So I'm not really sure, what Ananda thought he would get from all of this, except an understanding of how to become a stream enterer, which is probably what the Buddha was getting at. It was probably a teaching to him. Anyway, so Karunanata talked about this teaching in terms of becoming a true individual, and in particular in taking responsibility and for our lives and our own spiritual change. And these are things that I'm going to unpack as the time goes on. Now, if you remember, we learned that a stream enterer, and I will say more about this, what that is, a little bit later, has unwavering faith in each of the three jewels. And I'm quoting here, he possesses, it could be she, possesses virtues that are dear to the noble ones, complete and perfect, spotless and pure, which are liberating, praised by the wise, uninfluenced by worldly concerns, and favorable to concentration of mind. This is nothing new. We heard all this yesterday. So the mirror of the Dharma Sutta is the teaching about taking personal responsibility, but it's also a sutta about what you have to do to become what we call a stream entrant, or, and this was also evident in the sutta, how to avoid, looking at it from the opposite direction, a rather unpleasant rebirth. And it's not clear really whether it's the positive or the negative that interests Ananda. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, we don't have to worry about that. So it's not just you want to get a good rebirth, it's you don't want a bad one. Anyway, I'll say more shortly. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about stream entry, really to clarify and rectify the terms, because they are part of the sutra itself. I then want to say a little bit about the fetters, because there's a list of 10 of them. I want to talk about the first 3, because they're obviously related to stream entry. And then I want to say a little bit more about the true individual. Kulanata came with it from one direction yesterday, particularly contrasting sort of the true individual from a Sangha and from a group perspective. But there's just something else I want to mention as well. So let's jump in. What is it that Ananda is interested in for the sake of these practitioners? It seems to be, if you remember, that there were 4 cases that Ananda brought to the Buddha's attention, and each of them had a different level of spiritual attainment. The first one had eradicated the taint, so that means they had achieved enlightenment in one lifetime. Another had been born in a pure abode, so they had broken the bottom 5 fetters. I'll say more about this in a minute. And so wouldn't be reborn, but they'd gain enlightenment from this pure abode. The third one was a once returner, so they had broken the bottom 3 fetters and loosened the 4th and the 5th. And the third one had broken the first 3 fetters, and so would achieve something. So what is it that they would achieve? What's so important about it? So if you break the first 3 fetters, if you accomplish stream entry, you'll be reborn, or the person in question will be reborn no more than 7 times before they reach enlightenment. And in the meantime, they will be safe from falling into the states of misery, which presumably means they won't be reborn in various unpleasant realms, which you can be reborn in: animal realm, hell realm, hungry ghosts, ashuras, all those sorts of things. There are different places allegedly where that can happen. So assured they would be, and bound for enlightenment, as the Buddha says in the sutta. Moreover, and this I'll come back to and unpack a little bit later. Moreover, to be a stream entrant means that you have joined the Arya Sangha, the noble or holy Sangha. So you become a holy person in Buddhist terms. You're truly a noble disciple of the Buddha. So traditionally when the Sangha is referred to, it is the noble Sangha. It is the Sangha of people who have at least achieved stream entry. Importantly, while full enlightenment is very difficult to achieve in a single lifetime, stream entry is seen as an achievable goal, as something that is plausible. Although it still takes serious commitment, it's by no means an easy option. So what does it actually mean to be a stream entrant? I'm sure most of you will have come across this teaching at some point, but I'll say a little bit about it because it helps. It helps particularly because we can weave this stuff in with the teaching on the true individual, and it makes a sort of a powerful kind of intuitive case, I think. So the fetters, there's a list of 10 fetters. If you break them all, like I said earlier, you gain enlightenment. So it's a Buddhist list. You know, we've got lists for everything, haven't we? You know, so unsurprisingly, we've got quite a number of lists for enlightenment actually. But the traditional one, the one from the Pali Canon, it talks about fetters. You break the fetters, you go further up the chain, so to speak. So the word fetter means something like chain or manacle, and it's typically used, I think, this thing to restrain someone, and usually a prisoner. And I love this. I just love the idea that here we are living in a free society, as Kulanata talked about this yesterday, with all its temptations, and actually we're fettered, actually we're manacled, actually we're chained. actually we're a prisoner, and despite all our thoughts to the contrary. Now these fetters actually, they're obviously not real chains. They're just habits of mind. I mean, they're nothing else, nothing other than that. Habits of mind which, in a sense, root us to the spot, which keep us in a particular relationship to our particular practice. And of course, these habits actually restrain us, they limit us, and they imprison us. So stream entry is associated, which is clearly a level of liberation, is associated with breaking of the first three fetters. And I will say something about that, but I won't say anything about the other seven because they don't really concern us and it would take a long time. So if we could have the first slide, Stuart, I'm hoping that is a slide about fetters. Let's have a look. Yes, it is. Excellent. Well done. Thank you. So three fetters. The meaning of them is not straightforward, really. I mean, I think we acquire meanings which are often a bit woolly, and Bhante goes to quite a lot of trouble to put us right on what they actually mean. So it's quite important to go through them. If you look closely, you'll find all of this came up in Karunanatha's talk yesterday, but not in this form. So I think it's important that we go through it because you'll see how one view of things can inform another. So the first is the fetter of personality view. And the idea really is that the present personality of oneself as it is here and now is fixed, final, unchanging, is an absolute fact. I'm quoting Bhante there when I say that. And later on he says, really, this is a sort of an attitude. The attitude, and this came up very directly yesterday, that I am what I am and there's nothing to be done about it. So underneath this then is another view, which is one of two, which are both, from the Buddha's point of view, extreme ends of a spectrum, and he wants us to sit in the middle on this. Where he says people tend to hold one of two types of view about the individual or the self. One is an eternalistic view, which says that we last forever, we're reborn, the soul moves from one thing, so essentially we're the same being all the time, and nothing much changes. And the nihilistic view, which is that when we die, that's it, nothing moves on. And both of these are firmly rooted in the self, in a fixed view of the self, that certain aspects of the self are unchanging and we're stuck with them. And of course, from a Buddhist perspective, this is disastrous. I mean, completely disastrous. That you could hardly have a view that was more unhelpful to the spiritual life than thinking that you can't change. But it makes the whole prospect almost completely pointless, doesn't it? That if this is true, and if I asked you, we'd all deny this. But in fact, of course, we do believe that, on some level, or we haven't quite flushed out all the little bits of this stuff, so we do hold on to views about the self, I think. So this is the first one, any personality view. The second one is normally translated as doubt, but here he says, Bhante says, it's sort of more like an unwillingness to come to a definite conclusion. It's a state of kind of wavering. And he says, and I found this really interesting, he says it's not an intellectual uncertainty, it's more an emotional inability to commit yourself. And I just love that. I just love that, Of course, the stuff that we do can't be intellectually figured out. So really, if there is a doubt, it was never going to be fully that. It can be partly that, but I don't think it can be fully that. So he says it's the emotional inability to commit oneself. And what I've said in addition to this, and this is important, and I'll come back to it, is that it's a lack of integration. And that may or may not mean anything to you at the moment, but I'll unpack that a little bit later. The last fetter that needs to be broken is grasping ethical rules and observances as ends in themselves, rather than means to enlightenment. And what we often hear this translated as something like attachment to rites and rituals. And Bhante seemed really rather fed up about that. So on one level, there's nothing wrong with being positively attached to rites and rituals. I mean, it's a very good thing to be, positively attached to those things. The problem is when you do it as a means, as he puts it, as a means in themselves, because of the pleasure that you get, or because it means going back to the group stuff, or everybody else is doing it, I'll feel as though I belong. If I do it the same as everybody else, and I make twice as many offerings, and I chant twice as loudly, or I come in too soon, and I leave too late, and all this sort of stuff, the self gets in there, I think. Whereas actually, all Dharma practice is, in the end, a means to enlightenment. Without that continuity of purpose in mind, then each individual act can become not problematic. I mean, there are much worse things to do than to grasp after ethical rules and observances. But in the end, it won't be helpful if you're getting stuck in that particular area. Okay, thanks for that, Stiranaga. Now, I think my point here is that these three fetters seem to correspond rather well to a lot of what Karunanata was talking about yesterday. So when we're working with the self, obviously, this is working with the first fetter, although yesterday Karunanata said that this is what we're doing, is we've got this self, and we want it out of the way, really. And of course, that's related to faith in the three jewels as well. So it's not that you just sit there and try to grind out the absence of self, but you have to do positively something else, and part of that is going to be having faith in the three jewels. Obviously, developing faith in going for refuge too is going to help work with doubt, because, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. But the two are related. Obviously, to the more spiritual practice you do, one would hope, the more that the emotional problem of being unable to commit would be loosened. I'll say why that is shortly. And then coming into alignment, we talked about this yesterday, coming to alignment with the practices which are central to spiritual life. Do you remember we talked about why is it that conformity is less of a problem than we might think? Well, Karunanata sort of re-described that, I think, as sort of aligning ourselves with the values of the Sangha. So instead of regarding it as conformity, it's more a realignment of values. And this, of course, helps work with the grasping ethical rules and observances, because by doing that, we get a much stronger sense of what treating an ethical rule and observance as an end in itself actually is, by coming into alignment with other people and other practices which are doing the same thing. So those things are actually actively being demonstrated to us, and we're being encouraged and invited into doing those things, which will eventually help to loosen and break that last fetter. Okay. Let's just go back a little bit and talk about faith. So in what way is that helpful? So it's worth remembering, I think, that we're looking for, as far as the sutta goes, the Sri Mantra has unwavering faith in the three jewels. Now we know, because we've just said, that faith in the three jewels will help us to work with all three fetters. It's very clear that's the case. But remember also, and I'm setting up something that I'll come back to shortly, remember also that in the Nidana chain, faith arises in dependence on dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness. Yeah. So in other words, what I take that to mean is that faith in the three jewels often arises when everything else that we've had faith in predictably hasn't worked. Does that make sense? I mean, very often what we do is we come to the Dharma. We've tried everything else, all the other things that we've been trying, haven't done what we wanted them to do. So at that point, then, when that unsatisfactoriness or that dukkha exists, it's often the only moment when we're receptive enough to actually fully commit ourselves to something else, when we don't really have anywhere else to go. So I'm using my words carefully when I talk about receptivity. And at that point, then maybe that commitment to the three jewels really begins to come into being. So be aware, though, that you can't really practice faith directly. In the same way Kurunata said yesterday, I thought this made me laugh, you can't decide to have a sense of humor. You can develop a sense of humor, but you can't decide to have it. And similarly, you can... faith in the three jewels will arise when we trust in the practices that the Buddha has developed and which we've taken over. But it is dependent upon practice. This is the thing. So faith arises in that way as a consequence of action. It's not an act of will, and it can't be an act of will. If only it could. If only you could get up and say in the morning and say, I'm going to have unwavering faith today. And you can say this. I mean, I would encourage you to give it a bash and then see actually if that holds true for even 35 seconds. I challenge you. I challenge you guys. How long? Have a stopwatch with you. It won't be long before you're thinking of something else. So faith, or Shraddha, as I'm sure you know, is usually translated as what we place a heart upon. But in that, it can also have aspects of sort of trust and confidence. And so that really makes sense, doesn't it? It really makes sense to the idea that it's got to be related to going for refuge. It's got to be related to practice. So when Karunanatha said yesterday that the sort of the unwavering or the full commitment to ethics gives you a sort of a confidence that that if you do the practices, the consequences will come. Of course, the same is true, and it does that because faith begins to arise. If you do commit yourself to a practice for a particular length of time, it will work, and you will come into a different relationship with that thing. So I think all of this fits really well with what we know, or we've been taught, is so central to us. So the Buddha was saying unwavering faith in the three jewels, where we know that Bante's definition of the defining act of a Buddhist is to go for refuge to the three jewels. So we're all working in territory which is extremely familiar to us. It fits very well with them. Any visit to Padmalaya, if you don't hear the words going for refuge to the three jewels on that visit, I will be astonished. I think Padmavajra has said, I think it's true, but only up to a point, that he only ever gives one talk, and it's all variations of a theme. Well, the one talk is go for refuge to the three jewels. That's it, and he's quite right to do that, and it fits with the threefold way. So my point then is that the mirror of the Dharma, that unwavering faith in the three jewels, that need for purification through ethics, is all central to us, and we can find that reflected in the idea of stream entry. It maps very well onto the breaking of the first three fetters. So we've got. I like talking in terms of models, although I know it's not often the most helpful way to look at things. But do you see how it weaves together? Do you see how when you're talking about one thing, you're actually also talking about something else? That they kind of map really, really well on top of each other. But I can do better than that. Actually, I can do something else too. So I'm going to move on now. I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about the true individual and taking responsibility, because there's a problem, and we came across this yesterday regularly. There are many things that mitigate against going for refuge and faith arising and subsequent stream entry. I mean, it's very clear, that when we belong to groups, most of what goes on there doesn't encourage us towards going for refuge. It does the complete opposite. A lot of our conditioning in our lives, our family life, and so on, isn't saying, hey, you know what, Srikirti, you really need to go for refuge. Nobody said that to me. Nobody said that to me. Well, not go to refuge for the 3 jewels anyway, strangely enough. So it's not unreasonable to think that that something is going on which is not helpful, and we can identify this by looking at other things that Bhante has said about the true individual. Well, firstly, I want to clarify something that I've actually deliberately left it vague until now, but I think I'd better come clean. So if you remember, I said earlier on, well, the stream enterer breaks the first 3 fetters, joins the Arya Sangha, the noble Sangha, the holy Sangha, becomes a noble disciple of the Buddha, becomes a member of this, what was traditionally the Sangha. And I use those words. I talked about the noble Sangha and the holy Sangha. Now, Bhante, interestingly, takes issue with this idea that Arya or Arya means noble or holy. If you've read the 3 jewels, you'll find this. No, not the 3 jewels. What is the Sangha? He says that a much better translation for that word Arya is something like individual person. If you know the English translation of the T-Ratnavandana, there's a part in there which says in the Sangha Vardhana, where it talks about these 8 people, these 4 pairs of individuals, and it's that sense that he's talking about, these individuals. So the word, he says, means individual person insofar as it's distinguishing from the statistical individual. Does that make sense? That these are people who have a spiritual practice and have that spiritual presence, that spiritual attainment, so that they're not grasping or holding or looking for praise or whatever it is. They're a spiritual individual person. He gives this term a greater sense of what he thinks the meaning is when he translates it then as true individual. Yeah. So the stream enterer for Bhante and the true individual are not different. Am I making sense here? Yeah. And so the Arya Sangha is the Sangha of true individuals. So we're immediately thinking back to what we talked about yesterday as far as the true individual goes. And I'll say a little bit more in a minute to help us recollect that. But the point then is that when he talks of the true individual, he has a very particular sense of what that means. It's someone who is a stream enterer and has broken the first 3 fetters. But it's a switch in the language, I think, that's important. And he does this a lot. Because I think he's trying to make the whole idea of spiritual progress more accessible, more intuitively accessible in terms of the language that he uses, so that maybe so we then get an easier sense of what we're aiming for or what it involves. And certainly, I found it very moving when he talks about the qualities or the experience of a stream enterer or a true individual. It's very clear he's describing himself. He could only really have written from the position of. So he talks, for example, at one point about the true individual experiencing some loneliness because they're clearly very different to most of the other people they will ever meet. And I don't, so there's a kind of a sadness there, but I don't think it's a sort of a sadness in the way that we would experience it. But still, how did he know that? How did he know that a true individual would experience those sorts of emotions? So he goes on then. He's this we heard yesterday, but I'm going to repeat it because it'll help us. He says there are certain conditions that are necessary for the true individual to arise. So I take this as being sort of prerequisites for significant or effective practice. So he says we need a degree of objectivity, clarity, and intelligence in the broader sense. So in other words, if you're completely unable to break out of your own sense of how things are, you don't have any clarity or any analytical ability, it's going to be difficult to become a true individual. You are aware that actions have consequences. You are aware you are responsible for your actions and for their consequences, and you have receptivity, so you're not closed down. All of this came up yesterday. We might call these sort of the basic requirements, I suppose, of taking the path of the true individual. But I was waiting in the when I was reading. I think there's got to be a punchline here, Bante. Come on, where is it? What's going on? And there was, of course, there was, and I think this is the bit here. Let me go back. So I ended the last section by saying, but there are many things which mitigate against going for refuge and faith and subsequent stream entry. And we heard a lot about that yesterday. But so Bhante then moves on to talk about the thing which is perhaps the most important in terms of spiritual practice and the true individual. And this is integration. This is integration. So Bhante's proposition here is that is simply that if we're not as ethical as we'd like to be, if we don't go consistently for refuge to the three jewels as we would want, then we're experiencing the existence, and I don't know how metaphorical he's being. I mean, I would take it metaphorically, but hey, he's saying we're experiencing the existence of more than one self. And he said there might be, in fact, a succession of selves, and I think it says there might even be a bundle of selves. Heaven help us. But hey, there we go. That's the proposition. You don't have to agree. So what's the problem? Each self battles it out with the others for dominance at any particular time. But of course, only one self can actually be in charge. So in our more lucid moments, we want the true individual self, or the potential true individual, or the aspirant to be in charge, don't we? We want him to be making the decisions. Well, that's what we want in the morning. But by lunchtime, which self is actually in the ascendancy is not obvious, is it? We can't guarantee which one it's going to be. So really, I think this is also why faith arises in dependence on dukkha. We've been living with all these selves dragging us in different directions, and of course we try and resolve them in the way that Karunanatha suggested yesterday. These different selves are placated, by various forms of consumption, generally, aren't they? You buy something, or you get something new, or you consume something, which you like, or which you've learnt to like. So the point then is this indicates a lack of integration. So let me put it another way. If we are a true individual, what will be happening? Well, all those volitions which are pulling us in different directions, by definition, will all start to move in the same direction. Yeah? Does this make sense? Now, can you imagine what that feels like? Can you imagine that every molecule of energy, I don't know if you do have molecules of energy, but let's say they do. I'm being poetic now. Every molecule of energy wants to go for refuge. Yeah. I can't imagine the level of energy that might be, individual energy that might be released under those circumstances. I mean, it must be fearsome, actually, because you won't ever have experienced anything like that. because you won't have ever have gone for refuge to something with all of yourself. We never do. Yeah, even the things we like, we won't be fully there. So obviously, Bante's suggestion then is that in response to this idea that we are in fact not one self but many selves, well, we have to integrate those selves. Yeah, and we do that in two ways. So can I have the second slide, please, which I hope is on integration. I'm not very confident in my numbering system here, but let's see. Well done, thank you. There we are. So Bante says, well, what is it? What do we mean by this integration? And he says there are two forms of integration, and obviously this is all composed in the context of the true individual, or to use the other language of stream entry, and going for refuge. So horizontal integration is the integration of those selves that Bante was talking about before. So, I'm curious to know, what selves that you think you have. I know what ones I think I've got. And as we said yesterday, because Karunanata quite rightly said, when a part of this process is watching, isn't it? What's coming in here? What's trying to draw me away from this? I'll come back to this in a minute. But the point is we're integrating those selves. So we watch to see which aspects of ourselves or which identifiable self is constantly drawing us away. And we begin to work with those habits so that in the end, actually, we are just left with that, with this wanting to go for refuge. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't do other things. It doesn't mean that if you're going to be a practitioner on that, you can't be a parent, you can't be a son, you can't earn a living. It just means the volition behind those things is going to be directed towards wisdom and compassion. So you are going to be doing all those things, but you're going to be doing them as a Buddhist, as a true individual. Obviously, some things are not going to be compatible with that. If you're, I don't know, in the arms industry, or maybe you work in a slaughterhouse, that might be difficult. We talked about yesterday about how working on the docks was a harsh environment, and so on. So maybe maybe some of that just makes it easier to practice horizontal integration. But the idea really is that we're looking to work with those tendencies that draw us away. We all have them. But the other aspect of integration I thought was really interesting was vertical, where Bante says we need to experience an integration with our own unrealized higher potential, and we need to experience both our heights and our depths for this. Now, of course, as we integrate, that means we can go for refuge more fully. So our faith arises. I'll say more about this shortly. But of course, we want to integrate both, but into our being, into this true individual, the very best of ourselves, the very best physical, the very best spiritual being that we can be. So always having that connection, always having that. It's mindfulness, really, isn't it? It's that continuity of purpose, always connecting. I mean, it's really, I think, spiritual rebirth, if that means, if we can unpack that, if you like. But being in touch all the time, vertically, but also with how far down we can go as well, So it's always the positive in relation to the negative. Now we can't use this vertical integration as sort of a peak experience, which we want to replicate and keep replicating. But it just becomes part of the spiritual roadmap for us. We begin to understand that higher potential. We begin to understand how we work with it, how we can develop it, and so on. Without seeing that as part of the development of the true individual, then we're missing out on things. And in a sense, we'll always be reinventing the wheel, but just going round and round in the same place. Okay, thanks for that, Stuart. So what does Bhante say about this? And I think I've got, he's got some suggestions about how we work with integration. What are the things that we can do which help us to integrate in both a vertical and a horizontal sense? But he's got two warnings as well, and I'll kind that more or less end on the warnings. So could I have the third slide, please, Stiranagan? None of this will be any great shock to you. There's nothing here that you haven't seen before, I don't think. So Bante's suggestions for becoming a true individual. He begins by saying the practice of ethics, talking about the practice of ethics, as this helps with integrity. And I love this because, obviously the word integrity is related to integration, but if you like, on an ethical way. And he talks about being true to your values, and this then presents you to the world really as someone who has that integrity. And I do know people who in a sense hang a lot of their spiritual practice just on ethical integrity. And well, I say just, this is a strong thing to do. They sort of do it back to front in a way, insofar as what they're particularly keen to avoid is being inauthentic. That when they're looking to work with ethical rites and observances, they don't just want to be seen to be doing that. They want to really, really feel that. And to the extent that they don't, then they feel inauthentic in relation to the path. So for them, then, I haven't heard them use this expression, but it would fit perfectly. This practice of ethics would help, because for them, then the opposite of being inauthentic might be something like having integrity. He goes on to say, well, mindfulness nurtures integration as well, both on the horizontal and the vertical aspects. So meditation, for example, brings about horizontal integration of ourselves, of course, because then we gradually become more aware of how they are operating. We spot when one self ends and another one begins, or where they begin to mix up, where on those small moments, and actually, that took me in the wrong direction. And then, of course, it helps with vertical integration, because the deeper we can go into a concentrated state, the better that vertical integration will be, the more connected we'll be with our potentially higher self. And he says also that devotional practice and Dharma study both help with vertical integration, because that brings you, I think, into line with ideas of spiritual rebirth. The point I'd make, and this is of no surprise to anybody who knows anything about Bhante, is that these are all specifically spiritual suggestions, and that's exactly what you'd expect from him. But it is also true that it may be that psychological suggestions may be necessary if you've got a habit that's really difficult to shift, but which is actually blocking your path in some way or another. It may just be that you've got to work particularly with that before you can move on. Okay, thanks for that, Siranaga. I think the point I want to make is that all of those things that Bhante makes are things that we have to take responsibility for ourselves. No one can change us but ourselves. No one can go for refuge except ourselves. No one can develop unwavering faith in the three jewels except us. But I think also importantly, the more trust and confidence we have in more faith in the past, the more sure we can be of the outcomes for us. And this is just something that we said yesterday. also, I think, and this sort of begins the binding of one talk to another, or contributes to it, it's clear, I think, that the greater the degree of your own integration, the fewer selves you have, the more of yourself which you are using to go for refuge, the greater the level of responsibility that you can take. Yeah, I mean, you are limited if that process of integration is not undertaken. It's not to say you can't intellectually do some work, but earlier on, what we'll hear now, really, it's the emotional part that is really crucial to this process. I said earlier there are two warnings. Do you remember I said there are two warnings that Bante has? So the first warning, guys, I hope you're paying attention to this. First warning is that you need to watch out for what he calls alienated awareness. So what does he mean by this? Well, it's going back particularly to some of the things we talked about yesterday. But he says that culturally there's a tendency, particularly in relation to emotions, that are not helpful for the spiritual life. And he seems to be talking about where feelings and emotions are culturally or traditionally repressed, not expressed. He talks about of us being trained to clamp down on bodily sensations, particularly in relation to sex, for example. I'm not sure that it's as true of the current generations as it was of his, but this idea that sexual urges, for example, are a bad thing, that you should repress them and not really try not to experience them. He says also that, and we talked about this yesterday, that society doesn't have institutions now or values around which everybody can bind. So that does have an effect on any sense of solid individual identity as well, which he takes, I think, to be a bad thing, because I think it's where you can find not so much a place of safety, but a place where you belong, and so on. He also says that we're encouraged to repress negative emotions, and the problem that he says of this is that it can create a split, and I have seen this in people. I'm sure I've experienced it myself. It can create a split between your conscious and your unconscious mind. So your conscious mind can think it's doing really, really well because you used to be angry, and now you hardly ever experience anger, or you used to be greedy, or now you're not greedy. You used to be deluded, and now you're not deluded. So your conscious mind thinks you're doing really well, and your unconscious mind kind of knows that you're not. So if you work on your anger, and within and over the course of a weekend you think you've cracked it, that is alienated awareness. Does that make sense? Because you haven't cracked it. I mean, you may have made a really, really good start on it. But actually, we know that these things go deep, and even when we've got them, we think we've got them completely under control. At some point, they just pop up for no apparent reason. Well, there isn't always a reason, but it's pretty unfathomable sometimes. Our job really is just to think, okay, right here, there it is again, to understand it, get a sense of it, acknowledge it, always be conscious of it, and then to just carry on. Sometimes we have to burn these emotions off, sometimes we don't. The point he makes very clearly is that the part of ourselves which we are not experiencing, which we are repressing, will, in the spiritual life and in the non-spiritual life, of course, it will make its presence felt. Now, the expression that he uses, you'll have moods. This is what he says, they'll have moods. I quite like this idea of a Sangha full of moody people, all kind of experiencing things, and we're not quite sure what it is. But he, as he calls them, so it's basically negative emotions come out, and a mood is a kind of irrational thing. Is that you don't really choose to have a mood, and I think this is the whole point. This is the whole point for him, that it's unconscious stuff. While you remain cautious around this stuff, knowing that you're doing really well, but also aware that unconsciously there's going to be stuff going on, then there's a level of self-protection, and of course you're protecting others as well. So his whole point really is that he's encouraging to experience ourselves more fully, and it's only then you can take all of yourself along in the spiritual life. You know, integration is just that. It's not that you only integrate the bits that you know about. You can, you know, that aren't repressed. You've got to integrate the repressed bits as well. You know, and of course, just like we said yesterday, he says that the Sangha is a place of safety for this, a place where we can disclose negative feelings and move towards integration, where we can all help each other do this same thing. Last point before I finish. Warning: don't confuse a true individual with an individualist. Yeah. Now, I've just invented what I think is an individualist. I'm one myself on some level, so I feel as though I'm talking from experience and expertise. I might even be an expert individualist. I don't know. So we know what an individual is. It's that noble kind of guy. You know, he's integrated. He's going for refuge. He's got unwavering faith. You know, and so on and so forth. An individualist is generally someone who finds it difficult to commit. It doesn't really want to fully belong, so it tends to be someone who's on the outside looking in, although they might still be attached. Or somebody used the expression in my group, sort of bolted on. And I think an individualist is a bit like that. It's like something extra's been bolted on, but it's not part of the organic structure of the thing itself. They can sometimes be sort of experienced as difficult or contrary. You know, if everybody is saying that X is good, then they're more likely to say X is bad. I remember being in a group with somebody who's been a Mitra for years and years and years and years. They're not around now. And they wanted to come back to Mitra studies, so I let them into the group. And we were studying Living with Kindness, so, you know, obviously we're studying Metta. And he just announced in the group, after being a Mitra probably for 20 years, I'm not sure that I really believe in Metta. You know, I mean, why are you there? Why did you turn up if you don't believe in Metta? If that's not contrary, you know, you go to a Buddhist group just so that you can say, oh, I don't believe in Metta. Well, we can't work with that as a group, can you? It's too fundamentally off the wall for it to be helpful. So that's being an individualist. Does that make sense? I could say more. They don't really want to change, or there's certain parts of them that they don't want to change. And I think in part because they value the differences between themselves and others. They identify with the difference. Of course, a lot of the path that we undertake is to identify the similarities. So this is not a bad individual practice to see where we are doing this. And I think also and I might be overstating this, but there's a sort of there is some ethical conceit there somewhere. You know, there's a sort of a presumption that the individualist knows better than everybody else. And it may be on any individual thing, that's true. On any argument, the individualist could easily be right. And I want to encourage them to challenge. I want to encourage everybody to challenge. But if it just becomes a habit, then it's another fetter, isn't it? You know, it may not be named in the list of 10 fetters, but it is effectively a fetter. Anyway, obviously, there's a distinction between those two things, a true individual and an individualist. Fine. So, last slide. I've gone slightly over time. Sorry about that. Let's just recap a little. So what makes you then a true individual? Nothing new here. What makes you a true individual? And we heard all of this yesterday. You're prepared. We're thinking now in terms of the fetters. You are prepared to change. You are prepared to let go of any fixed views of yourself, even to die for those for that process. You are integrated enough to be able to commit yourself wholly. So there's an absence of doubt. And obviously, in the first one there, as a moving away from fixed personality view. And then in relation to the fetters, this true individual, does not confuse means with ends. Yeah, everything is a means. And then there's a little bit more that he adds at the end. So he says, further to this, an individual is aware of the influence that our sense experience has upon our minds, and of the need to reduce that influence through the practice of simplicity, contentment, and meditation. So it's very clear then that the true individual leads the simple, deep life. Yeah, it doesn't mean to say they don't have a washing machine. I think that's fine. You can have a washing machine if you want. Can't be attached to it, of course, but you can have one. But the point is, we're building a picture here of the life of a true individual. I think where they lead a simple and very beautiful life by the sounds of things. And an individual tries to be aware of negative emotion, not expressing it in harmful ways, and trying hard to cultivate positive emotion. Again, back to positive emotion. Whatever we say about the true individual, whatever we say grandly about stream entry and non-returners, none of this works without the cultivation of positive emotion. It's the secret ingredient. Well, not so secret, is it really? But it is the absolutely central ingredient to all of this. So then I wanted to return really to that beautiful quote that Kurulanata used yesterday from Shelley, which I didn't have in originally, but which I think is just so perfect a way to end. So he says, if you remember, the great secret of morals is love, or to go out of our own nature, and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful, which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. And only true individuals can do that. Thank you very much.